It was a frigid, silent evening. The faint glow of streetlights flickered weakly above cracked sidewalks in a neglected corner of the city. The sharp winter air carried an unforgiving chill, the kind that crept into your bones and stayed there. On one of those desolate streets, a young boy sat hunched on a flattened piece of cardboard, gripping an old, battered guitar as if it were the only thing anchoring him to hope. His small, trembling hands moved across the strings with surprising grace, coaxing out a soft, haunting melody that floated through the still night. The sound filled the empty street, a fragile echo of resilience in an otherwise unkind world. The boy's name was Marcus. At just 12 years old, his gaunt cheeks and hollow eyes spoke of hardships far too heavy for someone his age. His thin hoodie, riddled with frayed edges and small holes, offered little protection from the biting cold. Despite the chill that left his fingers red and aching, Marcus kept playing. The music was his quiet rebellion against the bleakness surrounding him. Beside him, wrapped tightly in a threadbare blanket, was his 6-year-old sister, Emma. She lay curled up like a small bird, her tangled curls spilling out onto a makeshift pillow fashioned from an old backpack. Her breaths came in soft, visible puffs of air, and every so often, she stirred, mumbling faintly in her sleep. Marcus glanced at her often, his gaze shifting between love and concern. The weight of responsibility was etched into his young face. He wasn't playing just for himself, he was playing for her. Every chord, every note, was a plea for survival. The few coins scattered in the cracked plastic cup at his feet might be enough for a loaf of bread or a warm can of soup. It wasn't much, but it was everything they needed to make it through another day. The street was largely empty, save for the occasional car passing by or the hurried steps of a bundled-up pedestrian eager to escape the cold. Most people paid no attention to Marcus. They walked by without a glance or, at best, offered a fleeting look of pity before continuing on their way. A few dropped coins into his cup without stopping, their eyes carefully avoiding his. Marcus didn't hold it against them. He was used to being invisible. Yet, his music spoke for him, raw and unpolished. It carried an undeniable depth. Each note resonated with the weight of his dreams, fragile yet persistent. The melody painted pictures of a better life, one filled with warmth, comfort, and freedom from the relentless grind of survival. It wasn't the polished performance of a street entertainer looking for applause. It was the honest voice of a child trying to make sense of a world that had given him so little reason to hope. As the hours dragged on, the cold grew harsher, its icy grip seeping into Marcus's thin clothes. His fingers ached, but he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Every coin mattered. Every minute counted. The music floated through the air, brushing past shuttered storefronts and disappearing into the dark. For Marcus, it felt as though the music was all that kept him and Emma tethered to something greater, a reminder that, even in the darkest moments, beauty could still exist. Emma stirred again, her small body shifting beneath the blanket. Marcus leaned over to tuck the fabric more snugly around her, his fingers brushing against her cold cheek. She murmured something incoherent, her brow furrowing briefly before settling back into sleep. Marcus's heart ached. She deserved so much more than this, more than the constant hunger gnawing at her stomach or the biting wind against her skin. She deserved warmth, comfort, and the carefree innocence of childhood. But wishes didn't fill empty stomachs, and dreams didn't chase away the cold. A man hurried past on the opposite side of the street, his coat flapping in the wind. He glanced briefly at Marcus before disappearing into the night, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Marcus watched him go, then turned his focus back to his guitar. His hands trembled slightly, but he forced himself to continue. The notes grew softer, more delicate, as though the music itself shared his exhaustion. Yet it persisted, fragile but determined, a small flame against the darkness. Time crawled. Marcus didn't know how long he had been sitting there, but his body was beginning to betray him. His legs were numb, his fingers stiff, and his chest ached with the dull, relentless pang of hunger. Still, he played, driven by the faint hope that someone might stop, not just to drop a coin, but to truly see him, to care. As he played, his thoughts wandered to a time before the streets, before the cold nights and constant worry. He remembered his mother's warm smile and the way she hummed softly while cooking in their tiny kitchen. He could almost smell the comforting aroma of her meals, hear the laughter that used to fill their small apartment. That life felt like a distant dream now, one that belonged to someone else. His mother had fallen ill, and everything had unraveled after that. They lost their home, and Marcus had taken it upon himself to care for Emma. It wasn't a choice, it was a duty, a promise he couldn't break. The wind picked up, howling through the street and causing Emma to shiver in her sleep. Marcus adjusted the blanket again, his fingers brushing against the guitar strings as he moved. The sound echoed softly, a melancholic note hanging in the air. He let out a shaky breath, his resolve hardening. He couldn't afford to dwell on the past. He had to focus on the present, on surviving tonight. Suddenly, the faint sound of footsteps broke his concentration. Marcus looked up, his fingers freezing mid-chord. A shadowy figure was approaching from the far end of the street. The person's stride was slow, deliberate, and their presence seemed to command attention. Marcus felt a flicker of unease, but quickly pushed it aside. Whoever it was, he would keep playing. He had to. Every note was a chance, every coin a lifeline. As the figure came into view, Marcus noticed something unusual. The person wasn't dressed like most of the hurried passers-by. Their posture was calm, their steps measured. Marcus couldn't make out their face in the dim light, but something about their presence felt different. And for the first time that night, Marcus dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would truly see him, really see him. The night dragged on, and the biting cold crept deeper into Marcus's body, numbing his fingers and making every breath feel like it burned. Yet, he refused to give up. He played on, letting the music fill the emptiness around him, his determination a flickering flame against the freezing air. Every note mattered. Every moment was a small act of defiance against the despair that loomed over him and his little sister. Then, out of nowhere, the sharp sound of footsteps shattered the stillness. They were loud, deliberate, and too close for comfort. Marcus froze mid-chord, his heart skipping a beat as his eyes darted toward the source. Across the street, under the faint glow of a flickering streetlight, a man in a police uniform emerged from the shadows. His boots hit the pavement with a heavy rhythm, each step exuding authority. The man's gaze locked onto Marcus with a cold intensity, sending a shiver down the boy's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. As the officer approached, Marcus's grip on his guitar instinctively tightened. There was something unsettling about the man's expression, an unsettling mixture of disdain and arrogance. It wasn't just the look of someone doing their job, it was something meaner, something darker. Marcus's stomach churned, a wave of unease washing over him as the officer stopped a few feet away. The man's gaze flicked to Emma, who was still curled up under her blanket, before settling back on Marcus. "What do you think you're doing out here, boy?" the officer asked. His voice was low, gruff, and cold, carrying a sharp edge that cut through the night. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. I'm just playing," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, "trying to make some money for food." The officer's lips curled into a sneer, his eyes narrowing as he took a step closer. "Playing?" he repeated, his tone mocking. "You think anyone wants to hear that noise?" He gestured toward Marcus's guitar, his expression twisted with contempt. "That piece of junk isn't worth the space it takes up." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut, but he forced himself to keep his head down, his eyes fixed on the ground. "I'm not hurting anyone," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I'm just trying to take care of my sister." The officer let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed off the surrounding buildings. "Your sister," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "And where are your parents?" "Huh? Let me guess, they ditched you, didn't they? Left you two out here to fend for yourselves." Figures. Tears welled up in Marcus's eyes, but he blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. The officer's words cut deep, scraping at wounds that had never fully healed. "My mom's sick," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the truth. "She can't work." The officer tilted his head, his sneer widening into a cruel grin. "Oh, so now you're a little hero, huh? Out here playing for scraps, thinking you're gonna save the day?" He took another step forward, looming over Marcus like a shadow. "Let me tell you something, kid. You're not a hero. You're a nuisance, a piece of trash, and you don't belong here." Marcus's hands trembled as he clutched his guitar tighter, his knuckles turning white. He wanted to speak up, to defend himself, but the words were caught in his throat. Fear paralyzed him, rooting him to the spot as the officer continued to glare down at him with icy disdain. The man's expression darkened further as he stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Go home," he ordered, each word laced with venom, "and take that useless piece of junk with you. Or better yet," before Marcus could react, the officer snatched the guitar from his hands. "No," Marcus cried out, his voice breaking as he scrambled to his feet. But it was too late. The officer lifted the guitar high above his head and, with a sickening crack, smashed it against the pavement. The sound of splintering would echo through the empty street, followed by the officer's cruel laughter. Marcus fell to his knees, his hands shaking as he reached for the broken pieces of his guitar. Tears blurred his vision as he gathered the shattered remains, clutching them to his chest like a lifeline. The officer stood over him, a smug grin plastered across his face. "There," the man sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Now you don't have to waste your time pretending to be something you're not." Marcus's shoulders shook with silent sobs. His head bowed as he cradled the broken guitar. He felt the weight of everything, the cold, the hunger, the helplessness, crash down on him all at once. Emma stirred under her blanket, her small voice murmuring in her sleep. But she didn't wake. Marcus was grateful for that. He didn't want her to see this, to hear the cruel words being thrown at them. The officer took a step back, his laughter fading as he prepared to leave. "Pathetic," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "Absolutely pathetic." But just as the officer turned to walk away, another sound broke through the night. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed from the far end of the street. Marcus looked up, his tear-streaked face filled with confusion and a faint flicker of hope. A figure emerged from the shadows, their stride calm but purposeful. Whoever they were, they carried an air of quiet authority, a presence that immediately shifted the atmosphere. The officer froze, his smug grin faltering as he turned toward the newcomer. And for the first time that night, Marcus dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone had come to help. The officer loomed over Marcus, his shadow stretching across the cold pavement. His voice was sharp, cutting through the stillness of the night. "You think you're helping anyone, kid? Look at you. You're nothing but a nuisance. Trash. You don't belong here." Marcus barely had time to process the sting of those words before the officer lunged forward, yanking the guitar from his hands. Panic surged through Marcus as he scrambled to his feet, his voice trembling. "No, please don't," he cried, his heart racing. But his desperate plea was met with cold indifference. The officer raised the guitar above his head, the moonlight glinting off its worn, splintered surface. With one swift motion, the guitar came crashing down onto the pavement. The sickening sound of splintering would echo through the street, louder than anything Marcus had ever heard. Time seemed to slow as the pieces scattered across the ground, fragments of his one lifeline now reduced to nothing. Marcus collapsed to his knees, his hands trembling as he reached for the broken remains. Tears streamed down his face, blurring his vision as he cradled the shattered pieces of what had once been his escape, his voice, his hope. The officer stood over him, his lips curling into a cruel smile. He took a step back, his laughter cold and empty, the sound reverberating off the empty buildings. "Pathetic," the officer muttered under his breath, his tone dripping with disdain. He shook his head, turning away as if the scene he had created was beneath him. But before he could take another step, a new sound broke the tension in the air. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They echoed down the street with a calm authority, each step commanding attention. Marcus looked up, his tear-streaked face filled with confusion and fear. Emerging from the shadows was a man dressed simply in a black coat, his presence powerful yet understated. It was Keanu Reeves. Keanu's sharp eyes took in the scene, the broken guitar, the trembling boy, the officer standing over him with an air of misplaced triumph. Without hesitation, Keanu moved forward, his strides purposeful. Behind him, Two members of his security team followed at a distance, their expressions unreadable, but Keanu didn't need them to intervene. He was more than enough. "Hey," Keanu called out, his voice steady, low, and firm. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Authority. The kind of voice that made people stop and listen. "What do you think you're doing?" The officer froze mid-step, the smug grin faltering on his face. He turned slowly, his brows furrowing as he took in the sight of the man before him. For a moment, he seemed unsure of how to respond, his confidence wavering, but it didn't last long. Straightening his posture, the officer tried to reclaim his authority. "This doesn't concern you," he barked, his tone sharp and defensive. "Move along." Keanu didn't flinch. He took another step closer, his expression calm but unyielding. The air around him seemed to shift, the weight of his presence silencing even the faint hum of the city in the distance. "It concerns me," he said, his voice unwavering. "When someone like you thinks they can bully a child and get away with it." The officer's face reddened, his composure slipping. "I'm doing my job," he snapped, though there was a crack in his voice now, a hint of uncertainty. This kid was loitering, disturbing the peace. Keanu raised an eyebrow, his gaze piercing. "Disturbing the peace?" he repeated, his tone laced with quiet disbelief. He glanced down at Marcus, who was still clutching the broken fragments of his guitar, his small frame shaking. Then his eyes returned to the officer. "Harder now. He's just a kid, trying to survive. And you think smashing his guitar and humiliating him is doing your job?" The officer opened his mouth to retort, but the words caught in his throat. Keanu's gaze didn't waver, and for a moment, the silence was heavier than the cold air around them. Keanu knelt beside Marcus, lowering himself to the boy's level. His movements were deliberate, his presence grounding. "Hey, buddy," he said gently, his voice a stark contrast to the harshness that had filled the air moments before. "Are you okay?" Marcus looked up at him, his tear-filled eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he just shook his head, his grip tightening on the broken pieces in his hands. Keanu nodded slowly, his expression softening. "It's going to be all right," he said quietly, his voice steady and full of warmth. "I promise." Straightening, Keanu turned back to the officer, his calm demeanor now tinged with a steely edge. "You need to leave," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. The officer scoffed, his bravado flickering like a dying flame. "You can't tell me what to do. I'm the authority here." Keanu took a step closer, his towering presence suddenly feeling much larger. "No," he said, his voice low but commanding. "Authority doesn't come from a uniform. It comes from doing what's right. And what you just did." He shook his head. "That's not right." The officer hesitated, his confidence unraveling as Keanu's words hit their mark. For a moment, he seemed unsure of whether to push back or retreat. But before he could decide, one of Keanu's security team stepped forward, phone in hand. "Sir, the local police have been notified," the man said calmly. "They'll be here shortly." The officer's face turned pale, his bravado collapsing entirely. He glared at Keanu one last time, his jaw tightening. "You're making a mistake," he spat, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. Keanu didn't reply. He simply stood there, unyielding, as the officer turned and stalked away, his footsteps heavy with frustration. The moment the officer was gone, Keanu knelt beside Marcus once more, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. "We'll fix this," he said, his voice full of quiet reassurance. "You're not alone anymore." Marcus stared at him, his tears still falling. But for the first time that night, a small spark of hope flickered in his eyes. Keanu didn't flinch at the officer's sharp tone. Instead, he calmly walked over to Marcus, crouching beside the trembling boy. His gaze softened as it fell on the shattered pieces of the guitar. The fragments still clutched tightly in Marcus's small, shaking hands. The boy's tear-streaked face spoke volumes, but Keanu's voice was gentle, his tone steady and warm. "You okay, kid?" he asked softly, his words carrying an unspoken reassurance. Marcus couldn't find his voice. He simply shook his head, his grip tightening on the broken remains of the instrument. Keanu nodded slowly, placing a firm yet comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. "Don't worry," he said quietly, the strength in his voice cutting through the heavy stillness. "You're not alone." Rising to his full height, Keanu turned to face the officer. His calm demeanor remained, but there was a distinct shift in his expression. His jaw tightened, and his eyes hardened. The warmth he'd shown Marcus moments ago was replaced by a quiet intensity that demanded respect. His voice was low but carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. "Seems to me," Keanu said evenly, "you've got no business treating kids like this." The officer's face reddened as his composure wavered. He puffed out his chest in an attempt to regain control, his posture stiffening. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" he shot back, his voice laced with forced authority. Keanu crossed his arms, his posture unwavering. "Do you?" he countered, his tone sharper now, yet still calm. He took a step forward, closing the gap between them. "Because I'll tell you one thing, you're not laying another hand on him. Or his sister." The officer's eyes narrowed, his confidence faltering under Keanu's steady gaze. His hand twitched toward his belt, a reflexive motion meant to intimidate. But before he could make another move, one of Keanu's security guards stepped forward, dressed sharply in a tailored black suit. The guard's presence was quiet but imposing. His voice, however, was firm. "Sir," the guard said with measured authority, "I suggest you leave. Now." For a moment, the officer hesitated, his bravado crumbling as he glanced between Keanu and the guard. He opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, the distant sound of sirens broke the silence. The faint wail grew louder with each passing second, and flashing red and blue lights appeared at the end of the street. The officer's expression shifted from indignation to unease as two police cars pulled up, their lights casting flickering shadows on the walls of the nearby buildings. Real officers stepped out, their faces serious as they took in the scene. The frightened boy, the broken guitar, the man in the fake uniform standing rigidly in place. Keanu didn't waste a moment. He turned to the arriving officers and pointed toward the man. "This guy's been impersonating a cop," he said, his voice steady but tinged with controlled anger. "And he's been harassing these kids." The lead officer, a stern-looking man with graying hair, exchanged a glance with his partner before stepping toward the accused. "Let's see some ID," he said firmly. The fake officer sputtered, his bravado all but gone now. "I don't need to show you anything," he muttered, his voice faltering as he took a step back. But his retreat was short-lived. One of the real officers moved swiftly, grabbing him by the arm and spinning him around. "No ID?" the officer said, his tone sharp. "Then we've got a problem." The man struggled weakly, his protest drowned out by the sound of handcuffs clicking into place. "You're making a mistake," he barked, his voice rising in desperation. "I'm a cop. You can't do this." The lead officer's expression didn't change. "No badge? No ID? That's not what I'd call a cop," he said coolly. "You're coming with us." As the fake officer was escorted toward the waiting patrol car, he turned his head, his glare fixed on Keanu. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice venomous. "This isn't over." Keanu didn't so much as blink. He watched silently as the man was pushed into the back of the police car, the door slamming shut behind him. The flashing lights reflected in his eyes, but his focus remained on Marcus, who was still crouched on the ground, clutching the shattered remains of his guitar. The moment the car drove away, the street seemed to exhale, the tension finally breaking. Keanu knelt beside Marcus again, his presence grounding and calm. "It's over now," he said softly. "You're safe." Marcus looked up at him, his tear-streaked face still etched with disbelief. "He broke it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It was all I had." Keanu nodded, his gaze steady. "I know," he said quietly, "and we'll make it right." Emma stirred under her blanket, rubbing her eyes as she sat up. She looked from her brother to Keanu, her small face filled with confusion. "Who's he?" she asked, her voice soft. Keanu smiled gently, his warmth returning. "Just a friend," he said, glancing at Marcus. "Someone who's here to help." He straightened, turning to one of his security guards. "Call my team." he said. "Let's make sure they're taken care of." The guard nodded, already pulling out his phone. Keanu turned back to Marcus, his hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. "I've got you," he said firmly. "We'll fix this. You don't have to worry anymore." For the first time that night, a flicker of hope appeared in Marcus's eyes. He nodded slowly, the weight on his shoulders feeling just a little lighter. The real officers wasted no time apprehending the man, his protests loud but hollow. He sputtered excuses and attempted to assert authority, but without any ID or badge to back his claims. His charade fell apart. Handcuffed and defeated, he was escorted to the patrol car, his head low as the officers firmly shut the door behind him. Keanu stood silently, watching the car pull away, his calm presence radiating strength. Once the tension dissipated, Keanu turned back to Marcus and Emma. The boy still clutched the broken pieces of his guitar, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the night's events. Keanu knelt beside him again, his voice warm and steady. "It's over now," he said softly. "You're safe." Marcus glanced up, his tear-streaked face filled with exhaustion and disbelief. He hesitated, as if the words were too good to be true, but something in Keanu's eyes reassured him. He nodded faintly, a flicker of trust forming in his weary gaze. Keanu didn't leave them there. As the cold night deepened, he made a quick call, arranging for a car to pick them up. "Come on," he said gently, extending his hand to Marcus. "Let's get you both somewhere warm." The drive to the hotel was quiet, the silence broken only by the soft hum of the engine. Emma, now awake, clung to her brother's side, her tiny hands gripping his arm. Marcus sat stiffly, unsure of what to say or how to process what was happening. Keanu sat beside them, his presence reassuring but unobtrusive. When they arrived, Keanu made sure they were checked into a comfortable room, complete with fresh clothes and a hot meal waiting on the table. Marcus hesitated at the doorway, glancing at Keanu as if seeking permission. "It's all for you," Keanu said with a kind smile. "Go on. You deserve this." The siblings stepped inside, their wide eyes scanning the room as if it were a dream. Emma ran to the bed, bouncing on the soft mattress, her giggles a stark contrast to the sorrowful silence of earlier. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, his gaze fixed on the steaming plate of food. Keanu gave him a gentle nudge, his voice encouraging. "Eat, Marcus. You need your strength." The boy nodded, his throat tight with emotion as he picked up a fork. The first bite brought tears to his eyes, not just because of the food but because, for the first time in what felt like forever, someone truly cared. Keanu didn't stop there. Over the next few days, he made arrangements to ensure their situation would improve. He used his resources to connect with local organizations, ensuring their mother received the medical attention she so desperately needed. Her condition had been deteriorating for months, but now, thanks to Keanu's efforts, she was placed in the care of skilled doctors who began the process of nursing her back to health. He also started a fundraiser, using his platform to share Marcus and Emma's story. Within hours, donations poured in from people all over the country, moved by the siblings' resilience and Keanu's compassion. The money raised would not only cover their immediate needs, but also give them a foundation to rebuild their lives. One afternoon, Keanu returned to the hotel with a surprise in hand. As Marcus opened the door, he spotted a large case in Keanu's hands. Confused but curious, he stepped aside to let him in. Keanu placed the case on the table and opened it with a soft click. Inside was a brand new guitar, its polished wood gleaming under the sunlight streaming through the window. Marcus's breath caught in his throat, his eyes widening as he stared at the instrument. Is this for me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It's yours," he said. "You deserve it." Tears welled up in Marcus's eyes as he gently lifted the guitar from its case. It felt perfect in his hands, solid, smooth, and full of promise. His fingers instinctively found the strings, and he strummed a soft chord, the sound filling the room with warmth. Emma clapped her hands excitedly, her face lighting up with joy. "Thank you," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling with gratitude. He looked up at Keanu, his tears spilling over. "I'll never forget this, ever." Keanu placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder, his expression serious yet kind. "Just promise me one thing," he said. "Don't stop playing. Music is your gift. Marcus, it's your voice. Use it to tell your story, to inspire others, and to change the world." Marcus nodded, his chest swelling with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. "I will," he said with quiet determination. "I promise." In the days that followed, the small family began to heal, not just physically but emotionally. Marcus's mother, though still weak, expressed her gratitude through tearful smiles and heartfelt words.